Some towns track their dead the way a careful accountant keeps a ledger. Each line reconciled, every entry balanced. Some towns don't. Welcome to the Night Skald. Tonight's account comes from Pastor Phil, the late father of the Skald and a small congregation minister with a habit of counting things. Before wearing a collar, he was a dairy farmer and an accountant. When he entered the ministry, he balanced the church's books by day and fought spiritual battles the rest of the time. He believed mercy ought to balance the human ledger. When the dead go uncounted, the books can't be closed. I filed this telling under Pastor Phil, the counting bell. The narration is in first person, from the point of view of Pastor Phil. I was first called to the lake when the Witch in November had come back for the season and the Homeowners Association had run out of patience. They kept their voices measured and their sweaters expensive. That's a trick grief learns from money. Never raise your voice. Quietly whisper under your breath and hope the problem goes away. It's every night, they told me. At 3:17 in the morning, a bell, they said, from the middle of the water, sounding 3 times. Carried clean across the cove and into the cabinet glass. In winter, the tone arrives like a line drawn straight through your sleep. They wanted a blessing, or a banishment, or a bill of service, something official I could sign that would make their windows stop singing. The lake, they explained, filled a valley in 1965. A dam went in, summer homes went up. The Army Corps of Engineers kept the water. The developer's name still rides mailbox posts like a minor saint. The old town in the center of the valley went under, along with the church. Graves from the cemetery were said to be moved. Said is the softest word for a hard job. There was big money here. From October through April, the shores were mostly empty. Mini Taj Mahals waiting for weekends, boats, and barbecues. I stood on the HOA pier at twilight and listened to the houses behind me go thoughtful and quiet. The fact that the bell rang each night at 3:17 made me recall 1 John 3:17. If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother or sister in need, yet closes his heart, how does God's love abide in him? Charity gets small in the shadow of big comfort. I had a hunch their problem wasn't the sound so much as the meaning behind it. They asked if I believed in bells. I told them that churches and ships both keep bells, and both toll in remembrance of souls that have been lost. You don't have to be out to sea to be lost. The next morning I drove out to the county archive, the kind of brick building where the clerk knows the difference between a ledger and a list. I asked for reinterment records, invoices, plats, maps, anything with numbers next to names. I've kept books for a long time. Find out where the credits and the debits refuse to agree. Someone had been in a hurry in 1965. The contractor billed for 128 disinterments. The church register, a thin book of cramped names and boxwood leaves, counted 131 graves in the cemetery. 3 were listed in pencil under paupers, with a school teacher's hand. The relocation letter described them as assorted remains for 1 row near the north fence. Assorted is a very cruel word for what used to be a person. The floodgates opened on a Monday. By Thursday, the sheriff's blotter held 2 welfare checks with no contact for holdouts who hadn't showed up for the evacuation bus. A week later, a hardware store owner filed a missing persons report for a cousin who'd stayed behind to help lock up the sanctuary. The bus manifest balanced. The town's roll did not. The official story said some folks left without telling anyone. The river said otherwise. I put those clippings in my folder and wrote, more unaccounted than unpaid. Maybe 2 different problems. Maybe the bell isn't part of either. I copied everything, then called 3 men with the kind of curiosity that buys wetsuits for a weekend. They were regulars at our congregation and had experience diving shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Those waters would be much too dangerous at this time of year, so I reckon they might be available for an inland plunge. They liked a mystery. I like to keep my feet dry. We chose a windless day. The lake wore November like a habit. Ice on the edges, black water in the center. They slid under the water skin and disappeared into the green that felt crowded and empty at the same time. Once they surfaced, it was with careful excitement, the kind that a person keeps when they know that their words could break something. They'd found it, the old church. Not whole, but there in outline and weight. Foundation stones like knuckles. Pews fused by silt into a single low ridge. The steeple gone, but a square of dark water where the bell tower once shadowed the sanctuary. Pastor once said, "There's no bell, but there's the remains of an old rope." They described a pulley mounted in what had been the ceiling. The rope ran through it and hung down into the darkness, hemp swollen and stained tea-brown by tannins. There was no current, and yet the rope moved as if someone below the floor were pulling. One of them reached for it and yanked his hand back. His glove came away scored, the palm hot and raw. Like sliding across a stove element, he said. He cut a sliver for me, a fray the color of old bread. Later, an analyst in the congregation put it under a magnifier and found iron oxide along the fibers. Rust dust where no iron remained. A ghost of a bell that wasn't there. They found something else. In a corner where sunlight figured the water, a grandfather clock like a drowned sentinel leaned against a fallen beam face up. Wrong down there, and yet somehow felt right. The hands were bent, both of them pinned to 317. The diver swore he felt the faintest tick travel through his wrist when he brushed the case. He laughed when he was telling me, and then he'd stopped. Back on the dock, I set my pocket recorder on the boards and let it run while we talked. That evening at the kitchen table, the tape held our voices and the creak of the wooden dock. Underneath, a light, regular tick, as if an old wind-up watch had nested next to the microphone, ticking like a thought that counted. Maybe something that was waiting. Earlier that summer, the association had installed an art piece. A sound sculpture, they called it. A submerged buoy with a tone clapper on a timer. The donor's son had studied acoustics. He swore he'd cancel the bell by emitting a counter sound, like noise-canceling headphones. Money likes to fix things with spectacle. The first night, the timer rang his buoy at 317. Half the lake woke up to a tone that felt theatrical, sweetly hollow, and a little smug. The second night, the people woke to the other sound instead. The low, lived-in toll that made cabinetry hum and sent hairline cracks roaming through dishes and glass. The HOA pulled the buoy by the weekend. The donor's son said something about bias and took offense. I went back alone on a moonless night when the lake had taken a transparency that felt like grief emptied out of names. The surface froze in a skin that would be gone by noon. I lay flat on the black ice at the public launch, hands laced under my cheek, breath making its own small weather. At 317, the ice spoke in lines. A low toll pressed through the lake and then outward. Spiderweb fissures running away from me towards the dark square where the church used to hold up the morning. The cracks made a geometry my eyes wanted to solve but could not. The vibration lasted 13 seconds, long enough to imagine the world was holding its breath. When the first real cold set the soapstone stove working, I went to the boathouse the association kept locked for craft that they called vintage. I had a key and the kind of face that doesn't get asked many questions. The night was so still that the stars looked like someone had hung them too low by mistake. I stood with my hat in my hands and told the lake what I knew in plain words. There were 3 on the books who were not on the bill. There were numbers penciled where ink should have gone. There was a row of associated remains. Mercy, I said, requires a count. Bells are for the living to remember the dead, and for the dead to be remembered. The boathouse windows fogged as if a warm-bodied thing had come inside. For a moment, I blamed my own breath. Then a line drew itself on the inside of the glass, straight and definite. as if made by the rounded back of a fingernail. 5 letters. Count. The second word followed like a refrain. Us. There are rules to spiritual warfare. Do not name the unknown, but if the unknown provides a name, test that name. That night, there was nothing to test, only a request any decent church would grant. I announced a weekday gathering that wasn't listed as such. A service of remembrance, I called it. I chose a morning in January on purpose. I set a folding table on the public shore, closest to where the old processional road would have run from church to Cemetery Knoll. I mapped it from a plat in the archive, penciled a straight path under 46 feet of water. I put the church register on the table and a short cross of driftwood, because people like to see a shape that they recognize when they're trying not to be afraid. People from the larger community came, the divers, the analyst, an old widow who had said her husband had been one of the last to leave the old village and had heard his name echo from behind. A few of the homeowners, but very few were there during the winter. The county clerk stood off to one side with a legal pad held like a hymnal. I read the names in order. For each, I said the name twice, not loudly, but clearly, and then a simple prayer from the Psalms. For each, there seemed like a small change in the lake's posture. I don't know how better to say it. Ripples went shallow to flat. The wind hesitated for a moment and then remembered to touch the surface. In a few cases, the change was nothing more than a feeling, one that an accountant knows when numbers align in a column and the sums land exactly where the hand expected. Balanced, audited, I could feel it. 3 times there was no answer. No breath of wind forgot itself, no ripple pause. The water gazed back and did not blink. I marked each of those with a check that dug into the paper. When the last name was said, I set the register down and spoke to the water the way a minister speaks when he wants to be overheard by the living, the dead, and the one that keeps both. I said, the duty to toll belongs to the church ground and to the keeping of its groundskeeper. The church is drowned. The ground is drowned. The keeper's work is done. In the name of Jesus Christ, who is Lord of the living and the dead, I bind that duty to the ground, and I loose the ringers to their rest. I will not command what is not mine. I will count what is. Count these 3 names as present. Count them as remembered. Count them as received. The lake went so still the reeds looked like they were set in glass. We waited. No one moved. And something uncoiled in people's shoulders the way an old rope remembers straightness after winter. That night and the next after that, there was no tolling at 317. Day after day, the homeowners slept in their proper place, and the widow said that the house felt less crowded. A week later, I brought the small Freya bell rope to the analyst for a closer look. Under his lamp, the iron stain looked like pollen. You know, he said, boats will ring a bell for a man overboard as long as there's hope. And churches, well, they ring to tell you who was passed and how many times. He said it like a man who was pleased with his knowledge, and I thanked him for his craft. The first thaw came with mud and forgiveness. Weeks turned into months. In March, on a day you could believe in, the rectory clock that hadn't been wound since the Advent fair chimed once at 15:17. I was in the kitchen. The sound came down the hall like a decision, just one tone, like the light touch of a ladle on a pot. It did not chime again. If you're waiting for me to say that a name appeared on a wall, or that the water wrote a new word in the frost, I cannot. The dead don't always send cards, even when you count them right. The bell at the lake has not tolled since that January morning. If there's a reason, I'll say it's the plainest one. Mercy keeps time differently. It does not forget. It does not rush. It remembers, and then it rests. As for the ledger, the clerk found a way to write the thing we all knew without accusing anyone in ink. The county added a small brass plaque at the public launch that only says, "None unaccounted for." People walk past it with coffee, and fishing poles, and children in bright jackets, and if they notice it at all, they seem to stand taller. I don't keep much from the places I'm asked to visit. A pastor isn't a collector. But on the shelf above my desk, there is a small object. A clock key from a grandfather clock found in the church silt by one of the divers, who swears it wanted to be found and ticked under his glove for half a heartbeat. I keep it to remind myself that time belongs to God, and so do we. When we're all counted, we can rest. Some lakes keep their surface smooth and their ledgers smoother. Others hold their account open until someone reads the names. If you live where there's a valley that was traded for water and weekends, look for a small brass plate at the public launch. If it isn't there, take a moment and count the names you know. Count them twice. The living sleep better when the dead are reconciled. If a bell ever tones through your house at 3:17, don't answer with your own name. Just remember theirs. Some places ask for money, some ask for memory. One of those balances the books. Sleep well. I'm the Skald, and this has been the Night Skald.